Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen, everyone in this debate largely oversimplifies it to government regulation is good and it's the thing that's going to help everybody, and fuck capitalism, these corporations are bad and greedy. But it's not that simple, because we have to ask a very important question of, in the African state, why are these industries even here? And in many instances, these things are multinational and foreign. The answer is very simple. Because inasmuch as Africa is very resource rich and they have a lot of potential, they do not locally or endemically have access to the industries to be able to mine and manufacture all of these particular things, making it quite important for them to be there. Opening opposition is motivated by the right thing of increasing wages, but is unclear of the mechanisms on how we're going to get there and how exactly under the opposition comparative it's going to be better. Top half clash of monopoly versus competition isn't necessarily that important, because regardless of what economic type you have, we think that strong state intervention makes it harder to do business, which ultimately increases the cost of the consumer, making it harder for the average African in an average African country to be able to buy shit and be able to live their life. What is the path to victory of closing opposition? We have two thrusts from Matthew and I. Number one, what is the interest of the African state on average? And I largely agree with what the previous speaker had mentioned. There are three priorities. A, economic security. B, social welfare services like hospitals, education, infrastructure, something that PM said a couple of minutes back. C, political stability. Basically, they're caught between a rock and a hard place of a balancing act of state control and also maximizing the investments from these large-scale industries and sectors. They want to be able to grow the economy, but also be able to protect the consumer, since the average African nation is a developing country and ultimately an emerging market. Number two, regardless of monopoly or not, it's precisely because these large-scale industries and sectors are profit-driven and margin-sensitive that they don't want to unnecessarily increase their capital expenditure and operating expenses, because as everyone agrees on, these are largely capital-intensive already. And if we want corporations to be able to do things like give people bonuses and attribute more of their funding to CSR campaigns and welfare support, we need them to be able to be in a capacity to ultimately be able to afford that when we have little or less state control, and this is going to directly respond to closing government. My first layer of analysis is to be able to talk about how opening government fits in and how we're going to respond them in response to my case. Opening government characterizes a problem that they don't necessarily solve. We agree that states have other priorities like social welfare and public services. But increased government oversight and bureaucracy, like what I mentioned in my POI, create perverse incentives to be able to cut corners and even be more exploitative. This is because you increase the cost of doing business. TLDR, things like higher taxes, lower investment incentives, and higher electricity and fuel prices when they're not the priority in terms of rates, mean that it's likely to pass off to the consumer because they want to be able to make back that lost revenue opportunity cost, making prices in the medium to long run significantly higher. This also looks like things like cost cutting and laying off workers and reducing wages or not giving them their due compensation, because on both sides, we agree, right? We want to be able to be less exploitative. But as the average African state, we also want what's best for our citizens. And ironically enough, more state intervention and control can absolutely make things worse. On the comparative, less and direct state control and those particular things, meaning the counterfactual, tax exemptions, investment incentives, and preferred pricing for things like electricity and fuel actually allow them to be able to operate more efficiently and gravitate towards the economies of scale in order to be able to have a buffer of profit and a higher margin to be able to give discounts, to be able to lower prices. Because they also want to be able to sell their commodities. They want to be able to effectively refine their fuel in order to be able to sell it to the petrol distributors for these people who actually own these businesses and actually own those cars who actually need it. That is to say, this increases their profits and allows them the capacity to be able to increase the wages through a trickle-down effect for the average African person who they employ or whose businesses rely on things like manufacturing and mining. Note, this directly responds to DPM who wants more worker benefits. Go before 6. I'll take the POI, whoever raised it.
Your site literally talks in, or it's literally stated in the info slide that your pricing is probably negotiated, and secondly, monopolies literally adjust the prices according to availability as well, which means there is no way.
Yeah, so if this monopoly is as perverse as you mentioned,
far more cheaper in your world.
Yeah, so if this monopoly is as perverse as you mentioned, then stronger state control to make their life fucking harder means that they have more of a capacity to be able to increase those prices. Look, corporations aren't retarded. They're not stupid. They also want to be able to sell in volume to be able to help the average consumer because they're margin sensitive and price conscious. And we have to understand that from closing government, they did talk about how, yeah, people die and companies are bad, but we think regulation is not mutually exclusive. Proxy wars on both sides are probably going to happen. It's uniquely through our side, when we have this mechanism of more decentralization and less state control, that we actually allow corporations and these large industries the economic runway to be profitable and ultimately have that trickle-down economic benefit for the average person, representing the interest of the average African country. For all these reasons, very proud to stand on side negative.